Out in the high plains where silence carries farther than song, and the wind seems to whisper names long forgotten, a woman stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a satchel of threadbare cloth and an old stitch Bible. She was 50, maybe a little more. Not the kind of beauty folks wrote ballads about, but there was something in her, a softness that hadn't hardened even after all she'd been through. Her name was Willa Hartley, and when she reached the dusty edge of dry willow, folks laughed. They didn't see a bride, they saw a burden. A woman too old to be dreaming, too poor to carry anything but stories, and far too quiet to be heard over their scoffing. One woman at the depot nudged her friend and said, "Even her bag's empty. What's she bringing to a husband dust?" But Willa didn't flinch. She just smiled faintly, adjusted her bonnet, and whispered something to the wind, something only the prairie grass could hear. Because what they didn't know was this: her bag wasn't empty. It was full of things the eye can't see. Faith, gentleness, a kind of courage that doesn't roar, it stays. She'd been promised a husband, but when she arrived, he was gone, vanished like so many men who speak sweet in letters and run when it's time to show up. Still, Willa didn't board the next coach out. She didn't cry in the street or beg for kindness. She stayed, and that's where our story begins. Because one man, a man who didn't speak much, noticed something no one else did. He saw not the emptiness of her bag, but the quiet fullness of her heart. He didn't bring roses. He brought nails and firewood, and then slowly, himself. And one day, when she was mending a child's torn sock and humming a tune, only the old remember, he leaned against her porch post and said, "Porter Rich, you're my home now." And friends, if you've ever felt overlooked, too late for love, or laughed at for what you lacked, this story's for you. Because sometimes what we carry inside is worth more than gold. And sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest truths and still choose to love. Would you like to hear what happened to Willa next? Because I promise you it's not what the town expected, but it just might be the story your heart's been waiting for. Out on the slow train slicing through the high Colorado plains, a woman sat by the window with hands too quiet and eyes too steady. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just held onto a tattered canvas bag like it held the last thread of her name. Her name was Martha Eliza Bloomfield, age 51. Once a wife, once a mother, now something in between. That bag had once held lace gloves, a carved comb, a tiny bottle of perfume that smelled of apricots and spring rain. But that was before her husband left her for the maid. Before her only son cast her out of the family ranch with 7 words, "Ma, all you do is make folks pity you." Now the bag held only stitches, 1 silver coin, and a letter from a man named Ephraim Cole, a stranger from a place she'd never heard of, Dry Creek Junction. "Sometimes one heart seeing you is all it takes," Martha whispered as the train screeched to a stop. "Even if you have to cross the earth to find it." The town was hardly more than a whisper in the dust: one saloon, with a sagging sign, a church with a leaning bell tower, and a post office barely taller than a mule. She stepped off the train into a cold wind that bit straight through her sleeves. No one came to greet her. A boy, maybe 12, stood nearby holding a box of apples, his face pinched with the kind of mischief only young boys and wild dogs know well. He looked her up and down, then burst out laughing. "Are you the mail-order bride?" He snickered. "I suppose I am," Martha said, steady as stone. He laughed again, pointing to her bag. "You come all this way with nothing he's going to send you back." Martha didn't flinch. She'd been laughed at before, but still her cheeks flushed under the sun. Later that day, she found a wagon to hire, cheap and creaky, to take her to the address scribbled in the letter. The home of Ephraim Cole was 3 miles outside of town, a cabin set against a field that hadn't seen corn in 5 years. There she found a man sawing wood, wiry and quiet as twilight. "Ephraim Cole?" she asked. He looked up, and it felt like the world paused, just long enough to decide if it wanted to turn again. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said. "But I did," Martha replied, her hands empty, her heart not. He nodded slowly. "Then you've already brought more than most." That night he gave her the back room. No talk of marriage, no talk of love, just 2 bowls of watery stew and a single cup of pine tea. Ephraim didn't ask about her past, and Martha didn't need him to. What she noticed was the silence. Not the cruel kind she'd known in her first marriage. Not the silence of her son's slammed door. No, this was a silence that listened. And she found that maybe it felt kinder than words. On the third day, while she was hanging a shawl on the porch, two women rode by from town. One raised an eyebrow. "So you're the bride with the empty bag," one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Cole's got more pity than sense." Martha didn't answer. She simply kept pinning her shawl like their words were nothing but breeze. That night, she sat on the porch steps cradling her bag like it might whisper back a memory of worth. And that's when Ephraim sat beside her. No words, no grand entrance, just a chair creaking beside hers and something small in his hand. "I found this the day you arrived," he said. Looked like someone dropped a tear that turned to stone. It was a small round pebble, smooth like a raindrop, cold like a truth. She took it without a word, but in her chest something melted for the first time in years. She still wasn't a wife. No one had claimed her. But in Ephraim's eyes, when she swept the hearth or fetched water from the creek, she sometimes caught a flicker of something steady, something kind. And sometimes, like that night on the porch when he handed her that tiny stone, she no longer felt like she came with nothing. She arrived with an empty bag and a past full of dismissal. But is there someone who sees worth not in what she carries, but in who she is? The wind had a memory out there. It rolled over the plains not like a breeze, but like a voice old and soft, but clear enough to call back what folks tried to bury. It was 2 weeks since Martha Bloomfield arrived in Dry Creek Junction. She'd begun to sweep out corners, plant onion seeds behind the cabin, and hum low songs her mother once sang while stitching hope into worn linen. Ephraim didn't speak much, but every day he handed her something, a handful of kindling, a nail for the loose floorboard, or a look that said more than language ever did. She'd grown used to the quiet until the knock came. A hard, urgent rap on the door, just as the stew had started to bubble. Ephraim was out tending a fence post by the creek. Martha wiped her hands and opened the door, her breath catching like a curtain in wind. And there, standing like a memory that forgot to die, was Clayton Ruse, her first husband, the man who'd sold the ranch after gambling away her inheritance, the man who left her cold and bleeding on the kitchen floor the night he brought the new girl in. She hadn't seen him in 8 years, not since the bruises faded and the shame settled. "Well," he drawled, tipping his hat with a grin he didn't deserve, "if it ain't my little lamb all dressed up in frontier rags." Martha said nothing. Not yet. She just stared, noticing the deep lines on his face, the empty bottle sticking out of his coat, the stink of losing. Clayton looked past her into the cabin. "Didn't expect you to land somewhere, so far," he said. "Heard a whisper from a woman in town, told me a big bride from Missouri showed up with nothing but a name and a sad story." Her hands clenched, but her voice stayed still. "What do you want, Clayton?" He smirked, stepping onto the porch like he still had any right to. "Don't reckon I need a reason. Just curious, I guess. Thought maybe you'd be grateful I let you go. You wouldn't be here with this rancher if it weren't for me." There it was, that old trick twisting cruelty into charity. Ephraim returned just then, mud on his boots, a coil of rope in his hand. His eyes scanned the scene, and he didn't say a word. Just stood beside Martha, tall and still as an oak tree. Clayton grinned wider. "Well now, this him, the one who took you in," he leaned forward. "She don't cook much, and she don't like to be touched when it storms. But you probably figured that out by now." Martha could feel her heartbeat behind her eyes. But Ephraim didn't flinch. Instead, he asked softly, "You need something to eat?" Mr. Clayton blinked, caught off guard. "I..." "What I asked," Ephraim repeated, "if you were hungry. Not lost, not welcome. Just hungry." Clayton scoffed. "I didn't come for charity." Ephraim nodded. "Then you'd best ride on." That night, Martha sat outside by the fire pit, hands in her lap. Ephraim brought her a mug of tea, didn't speak, just waited. "I thought I'd never see him again," she whispered. "You don't owe him anything," he said gently. "But a part of me," she replied, voice shaking, "still shrinks when I hear his boots." "Isn't that strange?" He shook his head. "Not strange, just human." Martha looked up at the stars. They burned like quiet promises, distant but steady. "I was 19 when I married him," she said. "He didn't hit me at first, just silenced me. Told me my hands were clumsy, my voice too loud. that no man wants a woman with ideas. Ephraim stirred the fire. My mother used to say, a man who needs silence more than truth isn't worth feeding. Martha smiled, the first real one since she arrived. The next day the townsfolk were buzzing. News traveled fast in Dry Creek. She had a husband before they whispered. She came here to trick Cole into marrying her. Women like her, they always bring trouble. At the general store, Martha stood behind two other ladies when she overheard one mutter, she's not poor, she's pitiful. Big women always think they gotta buy a man's patience. Martha didn't speak, didn't run. She walked home with salt and flour and a weight in her chest she'd carried since girlhood, the weight of always being too much or too little for someone else. But Ephraim was waiting on the porch. He took the sack from her hands, glanced at her face. They talked again, he said. She nodded, eyes low. He stepped forward close enough that she could feel the warmth off his shirt smell cedar wood and tobacco. Let him talk, he said. You brought more into this home than you know. Then with careful fingers, he placed something in her palm, a small wooden box carved rough but beautiful. Inside it dried lavender and a note. For the woman who smells like courage. And for the first time in her life, Martha didn't feel the need to explain her scars. Not her history, not her silence, not her shape, not her bag. Because someone without demanding anything saw her and stayed. Her past came riding like a storm, but she didn't break. And when the wind threatened to carry her name away again, someone held it gently. The prairie had its own kind of hush, not silence exactly, but a stillness so wide it could hold every word folks refused to say out loud. And lately that hush had been following Martha like a second shadow. It was in the way Mrs. Haddington's smile stiffened at church, in the way the pastor's wife handed her hymn book with fingers too careful, too polite, in the way children glanced at her skirt hem like it didn't belong in the aisle between respectable pews. And it was loudest in the letter Ephraim brought her one late morning, folded tight and trembling in his calloused hands. Martha read it twice before sitting down. Her knees buckled too softly to make a sound. Miss Martha Bloomfield, this letter comes at the consensus of the town committee. It has been brought to our attention that your presence here as a mail-order bride with no proper dowry, no family, and a questionable marital past is causing undue discomfort to several citizens. While we respect Mr. Cole's charity in housing you, we believe it is in the best interest of the town for you to vacate the homestead before winter arrives. We trust you'll understand. Dry Creek Township Assembly. Ephraim didn't speak when she finished. He just stood beside her, unmoving. Martha's lips parted, but no words came. All she could think about was the bag she arrived with, that empty sack that caused so many eyes to judge, before they even knew her name. I've brought shame on you, she whispered at last. Ephraim leaned down until they were eye to eye. No, he said. You've brought light. She blinked, startled. He continued, voice steady. You think I needed someone perfect. I needed someone real. Someone who doesn't quit even when folks hand her every reason to. Martha's throat burned. But if I stay, I'll make it harder for you. They might stop coming to buy your horses. The parson might not return. He shrugged gently. Then we start over somewhere else. But I won't let them take you away because they're afraid of what you survived. The town meeting was called the next evening. The sun had barely dipped behind the hills when folks filed into the little white chapel. Lanterns flickered in sconces, casting long shadows on wood-paneled walls. Martha stood in the back, Ephraim beside her. She'd put on her best dress, the same one she wore when she first arrived in Dry Creek Junction. It still hung loose at the waist, still smelled faintly of hope and dust. Mayor Rowland stood at the front, clearing his throat. This isn't a trial, he began, but an open conversation about what makes a good home and who fits into this community. A woman in a lace shawl stood. She came with nothing. A man with tobacco-stained teeth added, and she's no proper widow. No real claim to Mr. Cole's house. Then silence. And then Ephraim. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He simply said, when my wife died, no one brought food. No one sat beside me in the winter. No one noticed my porch sagged or my spirit cracked. He turned to Martha, but she did, with empty pockets and open hands. He looked back to the room. You say she brought nothing, but she gave me back my life. Still the room buzzed with tension. Mrs. Haddington stood up slowly. I saw her talking to the children by the river last week. They listened like she was telling them gold was buried in kindness. Not treasure, just goodness. The pastor rubbed his chin. She taught my wife how to patch the hem on her apron again, even though she was tired. One by one, the room softened. One by one, they remembered her not by her bag, but by her being. But not everyone agreed. Widow Carla Sharp, as the wind through broken shutters narrowed her eyes. She still doesn't belong. She wasn't chosen by this town. She's the kind of woman men pity. Martha finally stepped forward. Her voice was low, but it rang clearer than the bell in the chapel's tower. I don't need pity, she said. I've slept on floors. I've stitched through pain. I've been hit, left mocked, and I've never asked anyone to save me. She turned to face them all. But when I showed up with nothing, Ephraim didn't ask what I lost. He offered me his porch, his fence line, his silence. Her eyes misted. You don't have to want me here, but I'm staying. Not to cause trouble, but because, for the first time in my life, someone saw me and didn't flinch. The chapel was still. Outside, the wind whispered through juniper trees like it too was choosing her side. And after a moment, the mayor cleared his throat. I believe every homestead should be allowed to choose what makes it whole. Ephraim Cole has made his choice, and this town won't make it for him. That night back on the porch, Ephraim handed her a mug of warm cider. You were brave today, he said. Martha smiled faintly. I'm still shaking, he nodded. Good. Means your soul's waking up. She looked at him, the firelight dancing in his eyes. I've been waiting for someone to say that for a long time, she said. And now he asked. Now she whispered, I believe them. They tried to silence her with whispers, but she answered with truth. And sometimes that's louder than shouting. It began with a cracked teacup. Martha found it buried beneath old tools in the back shed, chipped and stained with something that had once been blackberry jam. She held it gently, thumbing the fracture in its side. Then, without telling Ephraim, she placed it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink and filled it with a little dirt, a few wildflower seeds, and hope. 3 weeks later, something green pushed through. That was how things began to change, not with grand gestures, but with cracked cups and tiny sprouts. Dry Creek Junction didn't throw her a parade, but things shifted in quiet ways. Mrs. Haddington brought over 2 skeins of yarn with the excuse that she had no use for purple. Pastor Clark asked if she'd consider reading to the children in the chapel on Wednesdays. And Ephraim, he kept fixing fences and baking that same dry cornbread. Only now, when she stirred the pot, he stood close enough for his elbow to brush hers. Not rushed, not loud, just there. One evening, while they peeled apples on the porch, he said, You ever think about a garden? She smiled. All the time. Then we should make one. Spring's not far. They started with a patch of dry, stubborn ground beside the barn. Ephraim turned the soil and Martha followed behind with seeds whispering to each one like a prayer. Grow anyway. There was something healing in that, breaking the earth open and trusting it could bloom again. That's how it was with her heart too. It had been scorched by years of silence, trampled by cruelty, mocked for being too soft and too old. But now, with every seed dropped into the dirt, she was telling herself, it's not too late, and she was starting to believe it. One morning, Ephraim left early to trade horses in Sweetwater. Martha packed him bread, dried apples, and a note she slipped into his coat pocket. Come back safe. I planted more zinnias. They're the loudest bloomers, just like you're the quietest comfort. That was the first time she'd written to a man since her ex-husband had forced her hand to sign away their marriage in a courtroom that smelled of mildew and lost years. She'd thought she'd never write tender words again. But Ephraim was different. He didn't ask for them. He made space for them to appear on their own. While he was gone, Martha took in the small things she hadn't dared notice before. How the children at church smiled more freely now. How her own shoulders didn't ache from bracing against invisible judgment. How her reflection in the pond by the tree line looked somehow less tired. And on the 5th day, Ephraim came back, dusty, sun-worn, and grinning. I sold the stallion, he said, for enough to buy new windows. She laughed, cupping her flour-dusted hands to her face. You know what that means, he added, stepping closer. What we'll be able to see each other better when the snow comes. That night they sat at the table she'd scrubbed clean months ago, eating lentils and onions by lamplight. Ephraim reached for her hand, rough palm against worn knuckles. No one's ever stayed this long, he said. She looked at him, her voice soft. No one ever asked me to. He blinked once, twice, then said the things she never thought she'd hear again. Will you stay? No, he said, his voice trembling. Let me be the one to stay for you. Martha stood slowly, crossed the room, laid her hand on his shoulder. You already have, she said, and somewhere outside the first snowflake of the season fell not as a threat, but as a promise. Later, as they watched the fire fade and the wind curl around the porch posts, Martha whispered, You know what I've learned? What's that? You can't rush healing. It moves like molasses, but when it comes, it's as sweet as honey. Ephraim nodded. And you're sweeter than both. She didn't just survive the storm. She started planting beauty inside it. The thaw came quietly, not like some grand announcement with trumpet winds or wildflowers marching in rows, but in the way boots stopped sticking in the mud and children's coughs eased with the warmer air. One day Ruth pointed out a robin hopping along the fence post, and Dinah whispered, It's really spring now. For Willa, hope had never been a lightning strike. It was a slow flickering lamp trimmed and tended, waiting for the wind to calm. And on that morning when she opened the cabin door and the scent of wet earth reached up like an old hymn, she knew the worst had passed. The land was still theirs, not just legally now, but spiritually. The townsfolk, cautious and watching from porches, began offering what they hadn't before, not judgment, but bread. A bushel of cornmeal from the widow at the mill. A patch coat for Ruth from someone who never left their name. Even the preacher, the one who'd once questioned her size and worth, tipped his hat outside the general store and said softly, You've made quite a home, Miss Willa. She nodded, not with pride, but with steadiness. The kind that says it wasn't just me, but I stayed. Elijah had taken to stopping by each Saturday evening, not with any grand gestures, but with useful things, nails, flour, once even a seedling apple tree he claimed just jumped into the wagon. Willa never asked if he was staying for supper. He simply did, washing his hands in the basin, drying them on a towel she'd embroidered with the kids' initials. One night after the younger children had gone to bed and the fire snapped low, Elijah lingered in the doorway. You know, he began, his voice softer than usual, this house, it used to echo. Willa looked up from the shawl she was mending. Elijah, he cleared his throat. After my wife passed, the walls got so loud with silence I started sleeping in the barn some nights just to escape it. But since you came to Dry Creek, since I started coming here, it's different. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Willa set her needle down. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the quiet man with the kind hands, but the boy he must have been. Hopeful, lost, waiting. Elijah, she said, I don't need saving. I know, he said, stepping closer. That's why I'm here. They never made a spectacle of their courtship. There were no big announcements. Just one morning, Elijah arrived with a fresh tin of coffee and never quite left. He carved a second chair for the porch. He fixed the leaky roof without being asked. He whittled Ruth a doll with button eyes and once braided Willa's hair when her fingers were too stiff. And Willa, once laughed at for her empty bag, now filled that cabin with more than things. She filled it with presence, with peace, with warmth that didn't need to be spoken. On the 4th of July, the town threw a gathering in the field behind the church. There was lemonade fiddlers and pie contests. Willa brought sweet cornbread, simple, not too sweet, but warm as sun warms skin. Some of the townsfolk nodded. Others asked how the children were. And then came a moment she'd never forget. One of the children, shy little Ruth, who once clung behind the cabin post like a ghost, reached up, took Willa's hand in front of the crowd and whispered, Mama. It was a quiet word, almost too soft to hear over the fiddle strings and chatter. But Willa heard it, and she knelt, brushed the child's hair from her cheek and said, Yes, baby, always. Elijah saw it from across the field, and that night beneath a sky lit with borrowed stars and paper rockets, he kissed her forehead and asked, not as a rescuer, but as a partner. Would you let me build beside you for the rest of our days? She didn't cry. Not this time. She just smiled like someone who had been waiting not for a miracle, but for someone to simply stay. And she said, Yes, Elijah. Let's go home. Years later, folks would pass by the cabin on the bend and say, That's the house with the woman who made something from nothing. But they were wrong. She didn't make it from nothing. She made it from memory, from heartbreak, from silence, and from the kind of love that doesn't show up in bouquets or ballads, but in fixing a roof, stirring the soup, staying through the snow, and finally being truly seen. Sometimes healing doesn't come like thunder. It comes like coffee shared quietly on a porch, like a girl saying mama under the July sun, and a man who never needed a rescue just to remain. Chapter 6. The Council and the Cold Eyes. The summer faded with grace. The corn turned gold, the hills browned, and mornings arrived wrapped in chill. Elijah had started building a second coop. For spring hens, he said. But Willa knew he was making room for more than chickens. He was planning for seasons. Still, peace in the West never settled long without a test. It came on a Wednesday, as peace-breaking things tend to do. Willa had just returned from the creek with a bundle of washed linens when she saw a buggy parked near the gate. 3 figures stepped down, 2 women and a man in a wool vest wearing a frown like it was stitched to his face. The preacher, Reverend Callan, and beside him, Widow Lattimore and Miss Charity Finch, who always spoke with more vinegar than scripture. Willa wiped her hands and stood tall. She knew this stance, the one where a woman must meet eyes without blinking. "Morning, ma'am," Reverend Callan said, eyes darting toward the cabin. "May we speak?" "Of course," Willa replied. "Would you like to sit?" He cleared his throat. "We'll stand." Widow Lattimore sniffed. "It won't take long." They didn't wait for her to invite them further. "We understand," Reverend Callan began, "that you've taken permanent residence here at the Hart homestead." "Yes," Willa said gently, "with Elijah and the children." Charity Finch folded her arms. "And no marriage certificate." Willa didn't flinch. "We had a private ceremony," she said, calm. "Before God, beside the stream where Elijah's wife is buried. The children were there. So was love. Love doesn't satisfy," land deeds, Lattimore snapped, "or tax records. And 7 children," Finch added, "shouldn't be raised under vague arrangements." Willa glanced back toward the cabin where Dinah was braiding Ruth's hair on the porch. Elijah was off in the woods chopping cedar. "I see," Willa said after a pause. "So this isn't about concern. This is about control." Reverend Callan blinked. "Ma'am." She stepped forward, not with anger, but with that particular steadiness born of every woman who's ever been underestimated. "I've heard this tone before," she said. "When I was told I was too old to dream. When I was left at a station by a man too ashamed to face me. When folks laughed at me for arriving with an empty bag." The wind stirred. "But this home was built not on paper or permission," she continued, voice low. "It was built in firewood carried through frost, in children tucked in and fevers fought, in hands held when no one else would stay." She took a breath. "If you think you can threaten that with forms and frowns, you don't understand what makes a home." There was silence. Just the sound of a windmill creaking. Widow Lattimore scoffed. "We'll take this to the county if we must." "You can," Willa said. "But I'll still be here. And so will Elijah. And so will the children." She didn't yell. She didn't cry. But when she turned and walked back toward the cabin, they knew the door had shut on them. Not with anger, with finality. That evening, Elijah returned to find Willa sewing beneath the front lantern. "They came," she said. He nodded. "I figured they would." She told him everything. He listened, quiet as ever, but when she finished, he stood, walked to the barn, and returned with a wooden box. Inside, folded papers, some old, some new. "I registered the land in your name last spring," he said. "Didn't want to spook you." Willa stared. "I wasn't just building a coop," he added with a smile. "I was planting roots." And she cried then, not from fear, but from the overwhelming grace of being chosen without needing to fight. But word spread fast in a small town. Some neighbors pulled away. A few whispered sinner, others muttered about appearances. Elijah lost a lumber contract. The general store raised the price of flour. It stung, and it scared the children. But Willa held fast. Each night she read aloud from the book of Ruth, not just because it was scripture, but because it was a story of a woman who stayed. And one night just before harvest, the town held a community supper. Elijah didn't want to go. "They'll look at you sideways," he said. Willa took his hand. "They already do," she smiled. "Let them see us standing." So they went together. Her in the dress Dinah helped patch him in his worn Sunday coat. The children sat in a row, elbows off the table, thank yous whispered with every spoonful. And then something happened. Old Mr. Avery, who'd never once spoken to Willa, walked over with a slice of huckleberry pie. "You fixed that fence out near Widow Lattimore's barn," he said to Elijah. "Yes, sir. She wouldn't say thank you, but I will," the old man said. Then he turned to Willa. "And you? You got a steadiness to you, like someone who stayed long enough to matter." He left the pie and walked away. That night, Elijah whispered, "You're not just surviving this, Willa. You're shifting it." She smiled into his shoulder. "No, Elijah. We are." Chapter 7. The winter they called her mother. The first snow fell without fanfare, as if the sky had simply decided it was time. By then the cabin stood stronger than ever. Elijah had finished shoring up the roof. The chimney puffed steady plumes of smoke, and the coop bustled with the sound of future spring. Inside, Willa sat beside the hearth, knitting by lamplight. Ruth nestled at her feet with a book. Dinah hummed as she stitched a hem. Isaac, now stronger, sorted beans by color, with his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. Elijah sat on the porch, whittling wood into quiet shapes. There was no feast that night, no grand event, but there was peace, the kind so deep it didn't need announcing. The letter arrived on the third day of snow, brought by a writer from the county clerk's office. Willa opened it with trembling hands, expecting trouble. But what she read made her blink, then blink again. It was a certificate of land ownership, signed, final. Elijah had submitted her name months ago, and after weeks of legal squabble and community protest, it was settled. The land was hers, legally, fully. Not because she was anyone's wife, not because a man vouched for her, but because she had stayed rebuilt and become. Elijah leaned in behind her, reading over her shoulder. "You earned every line of ink," he said quietly. Willa's eyes welled, and for a long while she said nothing. That spring they held a proper celebration. Not a wedding, though some came dressed as if it were. No white gown, no pastor's blessing. Just a potluck, a fiddle, and neighbors, who now nodded without hesitation. One by one the children stood and spoke. Dinah thanked Willa for teaching her how to hem and how to hope. Isaac whispered that her hands smelled like safety. And Ruth, still only 5, climbed into Willa's lap and said, "You're my always, Mama." There was no applause, just a hush so tender it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Later that night, after the guests had gone, and the children slept in a dog pile of quilts and crumbs, Willa and Elijah stood at the edge of the porch, stars above them, quiet beneath. "You remember when they laughed at me for having an empty bag?" Willa asked softly. Elijah smiled. "I do." She nodded toward the cabin behind them. "I carried nothing but faith. But look what it grew." Elijah took her hand. "That bag of yours wasn't empty, Willa. It just carried things the world couldn't see yet." The years passed gently, like a hymn hummed over time. Willa became something of a legend. The woman who arrived with nothing but stayed to raise 7 children, fix fences, tame winters, and soften a man whose heart had nearly frozen shut. People said Elijah carved her a rocking chair from the same cedar that framed their porch, that she planted peonies at every grave, even the ones no one visited, that she never raised her voice, but somehow everyone listened. But the truth was simpler. She loved quietly, completely. And when the children grew, when Dinah married the school teacher, and Isaac became a farrier, and Ruth painted stories on canvas, Willa sat on the porch with Elijah, 2 chairs, 1 blanket, watching dusk melt into memory. In her final years, visitors would come just to sit with her. They'd ask, "How did you do it, Miss Willa?" And she'd smile, touching the faded leather of that old empty bag now resting on the mantel. "I didn't wait for someone to give me a home," she'd say. "I became one. Some women carry gold, others diamonds. But the strongest carry faith, patience, and the quiet courage to stay." This was Willa's story, and maybe, dear heart, a piece of yours too. And so Willa stayed, not because anyone begged her to, but because a quiet man with weathered hands looked at her and didn't see what she lacked. He saw what she'd carried all along: patience, kindness, and the courage to keep showing up. She had once been laughed at for bringing an empty bag. Now she rocked a child to sleep on a porch that smelled of pine and supper, while a man who had known sorrow and chosen gentleness anyway sat beside her and said, This is home." Dear friends, maybe you felt like Willa at some point in your life, rejected for how you look, where you come from, or simply for being too much too late. But here's the truth. You are not what others walk away from. You are what someone kind, someone ready might still walk toward. Because love, real love, doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the form of someone who just stays. If this story touched something tender in you, we'd be honored to have you stay a little longer with us. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga for more stories of quiet strength, late blooming love, and the kind of kindness that doesn't shout but never leaves. Tell us in the comments, would you like to see what happens next in Willa's story? Or maybe you'd like another tale of someone finding love just when they thought it had passed them by. Your words matter, your story matters, and maybe it's time we tell yours too. Until then, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep riding toward your own horizon.